Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We've got a lot to talk about today. We are coming off the Supreme Court nomination hearings. We have the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is in an eerie kind of way starting to seem kind of normal. That we've got this really intense shooting war right in the I don't know if it's the center of Europe, but right, kind of right there in the middle, and not in a small country, landmass wise, one of the biggest countries in Europe. I don't know exactly. Maybe might even be biggest after Russia. I don't know exactly. I shouldn't go in these free form speculations. Before we get to more news, I want to remind everybody, if you are listening to this podcast, if you're a listener to this podcast and you are not a member of TPM, if you're not a TPM Prime subscriber, TPM Prime AF subscriber, please consider subscribing. We are right in the middle of an annual membership drive. It's really important. We need to take more of our readers and listeners and convert them into members, subscribers. So it's really important. And I certainly know, there's lots of podcasts and sites, and kind of you have to subscribe to everything these days. And you can't subscribe to everything. I get that. And I often have, some publication like, oh yeah, I should subscribe to that one. I want to read all their stuff, want to support what they're doing, and kind of like I'm agreed in principle, but I just don't get to it, right? Because I'm busy and I have a short attention span and all that kind of stuff. But what we're doing during this drive is to say, can you take a moment today and become a member and subscribe to TPM, because it's really, really important to what we do. It makes what we do possible. More than 80% of the revenue that funds our whole operation comes from membership fees. So, pretty small amount of money for most of us. $5.99 a month, $60 a year. Pretty manageable. So we'd really appreciate it if you would join us. Make today the day. So let's get back to the news. As I said, we have these the Supreme Court nomination hearings, and just before we started recording this episode, I was talking to my co-host Kate Rika, and Kate was there in the hearings. He covered them for us. So we're going to go over all the kind of the ins and outs of that. But one of the things she talked about, which is something that is unique, maybe not unique, but it is pretty distinct about our operation, is that Kate had the experience of, the other news organizations have a team covering the hearings, and they kind of, sort of like when, like a basketball game, you sub one person in, send another person in, the other person comes out, takes a breather, maybe they do some tweeting, maybe they write up their piece. But TPM is a very, very small operation. And so Kate was there for the entire thing, listening to all the stuff, doing most of the live blog that we were doing. So that is, I want to talk about some of the experience of doing that. But in terms of our drive, this is also this is a key aspect of what TPM is about. We're a small operation. We do things a certain way. You pick this stuff up from CBS or NBC. I mean, we've got alums at both of those places, but would you tell the difference if it was ABC or CBS or NBC? You'll tell the difference when it's us. We're a unique place. And part of doing what we do is that you've got Kate, and she's there for the entire time while, the other folks are out there, I don't know, take a tweeting break, take a walk, come out and, go out, have a few tacos, do whatever you're doing. So let's talk about that first, Kate. Let's talk about what it is like. Everybody sees when they watch, the kind of the clips from these hearings, they see those kind of rows of people in the back. You see reporters and stuff. What's it like? What's it like being there? And how long were you there? Like, walk us through the whole thing.
Right. So it's funny because kind of being from a smaller outlet presents, unique challenges all the way through something like this. For example, I kind of started communicating with the Senate Judiciary Committee staff the day that Ketanji Brown Jackson was announced as the nominee, because I knew this would be a really kind of big ticket hearing and that it was going to be hard for us to get a seat. So, I kind of had to do that from the beginning. There was a lot of back and forth. I ultimately managed to get a seat in the room for Wednesday. And it's hard because other places, I'm talking your Politicos, your CNNs, places that have huge congressional teams, you you just don't have to fight so tooth and claw like that. It's more, because these people are always, and I'm not trying to say this, there's something kind of insidious going on. They've got people who have got the bandwidth to just be on the Hill every day. That's what they can do because their team is big enough that it allows for that. So kind of they get seats every day. They're an assumed presence there. So there's that kind of logistical piece of it. So then you arrive, and it's funny because it's like there are press seats in the front of the room that have a long table for your laptops, and then you got the cheap seats on the sides that have no table. I was in a cheap seat, which, while I'm in the prime of my youth, means that I had to kind of sit there for like, whatever, 10, 12 hours hunched over my laptop, and I had the back pain of an octogenarian by the end of the day. But so anyway, we're in these seats, and you've got what you see on C-SPAN. The dais is in front of us, kind of facing us. And something that I think is hard to see on C-SPAN is like you've got the big kind of fancy wooden dais, and then a lower one, and the senators were spread out between them. I'm not sure if that's like a COVID precaution or what, but that's kind of how they're sitting right now. And I promise it felt very important and special to me to be there. So take this complaint in that light, which is that they got to invest in better chairs for the plebes. We had like these little crappy plastic folding chairs basically, and the senators have these like cushy thrones. I was considering just dragging one over to my seat, but so it's like that. And then for an event like this, which is kind of big and special for people, they give out tickets. The lawmakers are given tickets that they can give to staff members or people who kind of want to be there. But there's such a high volume of people who want to share in the moment of Judge Jackson's, confirmation process, that they shuttle guests in and out, I think probably every 30 minutes or so. So everyone shuffles in, kind of dressed in their like Capitol formal best, and sits there and listens, and then up, out. And outside, there's like a long line outside the room for people's tickets. So basically, we all come in there. It looks like it does on C-SPAN with, the people get to ask, senators get to ask their questions. I would say an interesting part that you can't see on TV is what the other lawmakers are doing while the primary lawmaker is talking. A lot of that is being on their phones, very, very much of that. There's some people kind of show up for their questioning and leave. I would say that's not common, but to call out one in particular, yesterday, Tom Cotton kind of strolled in with his coffee, hectored Jackson, and like that was it. Lindsey Graham, after he did his little shouty fit, he stormed out and left for the day. And then you've got people like the participation award has got to go to Cory Booker, who button seat the whole time except when he was voting, and also did that kind of good student thing where they sit there and nod to let the professor know that someone's listening. That Cory Booker gets the award for that. um
Is it? I haven't been up there in a very long time, but I was always struck that when you're there, it all looks much smaller.
yeah.
That kind of like, you see that they're all the senators are all spread out kind of in a, not a semicircle, but kind of an arcing
Hmm.
row of seats, and it kind of looks like, across an expanse is the person testifying sitting at a big table. And I don't know, it just seems much bigger, and you see it in person, like, wow, we're in like a little room here, and just we're all, was
Hmm.
that your sense too?
Yeah, and part of it is the back wall is marble and has the big kind of fancy Senate crest in the middle. And so that's the backdrop when most of the senators are talking, but it's just the one wall that's like that. So it is to some degree almost like a TV set, like
Yeah.
the fancy stuff is going to be right behind the cameras. Um, yeah, and I think before we kind of move on to the content of the hearing, just a piece on the way our reporting is a little bit different is that to some degree with something like this, I'm competing with a lot of other reporters and we're all getting the same information, right? So it's, to some degree kind of hard just in that it feels sometimes that things like Twitter or even something like Twitter, which seems kind of silly, dumb, superficial. It's a really important part of reporting. It's a really important part of reaching people. And I personally freaking hate Twitter because I think it is so hard to convey context in a tweet at all. And I think that just so kind of aggravates the already existing problem of just tweeting out quotes that are not true or kind of particularly Republican antics with no context for people to understand why they're dangerous or anything like that. So I try to be kind of hyper conscious of doing that in my tweets, but it's hard then because I'm sitting kind of side by side with like a CNN reporter or Washington Post reporter or whatever who will kind of blast out the same thing that I'm reporting on, but sans context to like 8 bajillion followers. And I'm like trying to ground people in what's going on, but I have a much smaller reach and I have to depend on the firepower of say a Josh Marshall to kind of amplify what I'm trying to put out there. So it's this weird balance and it's this weird dance, and those kind of social aspects of it do play into everything, right? Because it's also lawmakers know better the people who are on the Hill every day, and that cuts in many ways, right? Because that can make lawmakers more willing to talk to reporters. It can make it hard for those reporters to ask combative, aggressive questions because they don't want to be cut off from their source of information. I think there's a dynamic where reporters who are there all the time are good friends with each other and spend all their time with each other. And it can be hard, I think, to have a different viewpoint on things when kind of your peers and colleagues are uh, all you're with them and communicating with them so much. So there's all of this stuff going on, and it's a weird, interesting experience. And I think just before we move on, a point you made too about the smallness of the room, it put moments like the hectoring from Cruz and Holly and Cotton and Graham, it felt so different to be in the room than it felt the other days when I had to cover it on TV because you realize they're only like 30 feet apart from her.
Yeah,
And so,
when you see it on TV, it's almost like, if you're in a baseball stadium
right,
or kind of like what you might imagine the house floor is like. Although when you're there, the house floor seems really small too.
right.
But I take your point. It's more uncomfortable because you're kind
Much
of
more
like
uncomfortable.
you're right there. Like that's that kind of feeling you feel when you're like you're I sympathize more with her, but you kind of feel uncomfortable for everybody. Ugh, like this is not comfortable.
It's like when you see, like a fight break out in a story you're in or something. It is profoundly uncomfortable to see someone making someone else uncomfortable. And that is so heightened when she's sitting right there and she looks like a human and doesn't look like a character on TV. And then her husband's behind her and her daughter's behind her. And you're watching, these kind of Republican senators like angle themselves to make sure the camera is getting them and doing their gesticulating. And then it's so weird because you have this drag out thing where you have, Senator Hawley being like, "Do you regret it? Do you regret your sentences?" These like really, really intense moment, and then boom, it's over, and the mic passes to a Democrat, and the Republicans are just like go on their phones or leave the room or sip their coffee, and it's like that you put on this mask and you perform and then you take it off, but the person who was kind of subjected to the attack is still sitting right there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of the fakeness
Mm-hmm.
of all of it. I mean, this is different, but I do remember during President Trump's first impeachment, there was this moment where Lindsey Graham and I wasn't there. I saw this. I either heard it reported or saw it, kind of on TV or something like that. After the day's, hearings or session or whatever, he ran into Schiff and he's like, "Hey, great work there, man. You really brought it." And you're sort of like, "What?" Like, he's out there saying, just what you thought Lindsey Graham was saying, but you see in moments like that, like it's all for show, right?
Mhm.
It's all for show, and
I
and
think
and yeah.
it's similar to, remember when Dianne Feinstein hugged Graham and it like set the whole internet ablaze? It's like I totally get that, but also when you see it in person, you kind of understand how that could happen because there is just it's not like anything else I've seen in my life. It really is a widely accepted performative thing.
hmm Well, it's also, and this is, this goes very deep into lots of stuff about, sort of insiders and outsiders and the perception of being an outsider, perception of being an insider. When I lived in DC, I was all the kind of the people, the conservatives, the right wingers. I knew all those people. I'm not sure I was friends with them, but I was acquaintances with them. I wasn't, there was no discomfort, hung out with those people, whatever. And a lot of that's just, and it's funny when I lived in DC, and I lived in DC from 1999 to 2004, till the end of 2004. So the first few years of just before TPM and the first few years of TPM. And the reason I moved to New York had nothing, it was for personal reasons. I moved there to get married, basically. But there are pros and cons on both sides of that. One of the things that I found grounding about living in DC is if like I kind of if you sort of like haul off and just lay into someone, you're probably going to see them. And if you see them, they might say, "Hey man, what you said really that's not true." You're kind of laying it on a bit thick, and that's not really, and maybe it is true, but it does at least. There's two sides of it. You want to kind of not worry about the discomfort of seeing someone in person. On the other hand, it brushes you back a little bit in ways that are positive, because when you're writing, you say, I want to be solid enough on this and feel like I can stand behind it. So if they come up and say, "Hey, that wasn't fair," I'll say, like, "You know what? I think it is fair." And that just keeps things a little more realistic. Now, the other thing, when I left DC, I felt liberated in a way that I wasn't like, I mean, I never really ran in those circles, but I kind of did. I was like adjacent to those circles. I kind of like, I'm not worried about seeing you. So I don't care. And it's interesting, both sides. And I know this is kind of a different point than the one you're making. Um, but I can see that whole. I mean, when she did that, it was sort of like okay, we get the problem. Because and that was like, I do think a lot of, during the Kavanaugh hearings, I think a lot of it was not performative. I think that I know that a lot of the Democrats were very upset, and a lot of the Republicans were very upset. I think it was pretty real. And her, you know, you got to read the room, right? That was not reading the room, and it's that kind of thing where that I think we have talked about at different points in over the years with the podcast. Who are you there for? Is it up there kind of like for people can have a, what the best way, most enjoyable way, most satisfying way to do senatoring? Or is it kind of like there's a group of voters who put you there for a reason? We paid the money, we gave you the votes, and how fun it is not our thing, and all those things are anyway. I've taken you
No, no,
way
no.
off the
That's interesting, and it
yeah.
does kind of tie into one of my thoughts watching this, which is I very much agree with you that I think the emotion of the Kavanaugh hearing was genuine, and a lot of that is because it was not premeditated. It largely came out as the hearings had begun.
Yep.
I think people, whether they agreed with her or not, found what Christine Blasey Ford had to say, I guess compelling is too positive, but they felt it,
It
you
was
know?
intense. It was
Yeah.
intense.
Um, and the difference this time was that the bulk of the discomfort came with the Republican attacks on her sentencing of people who possessed child pornography. It was something that Josh Hawley had telegraphed before the hearings. I am now convinced because he is more junior than Ted Cruz, so he knew his questioning would come later, and he knew that Ted would steal his thunder, which he very much did. Um, so it did not feel genuine. It did not. I mean, Cruz was unable to cloak his excitement under the veil of concern that some of the others pulled off. And it, even if you kind of came into it not knowing the context, not knowing what they're getting at with this kind of attack, there's no way for a second that you could think it was any kind of genuine fact finding, because to begin with, it was based on, I think, 7 cases, and then from that, they plucked out lines that they thought were damning for her. And when she tried to respond and explain about the complexities that goes into sentencing people who possess child pornography, they interrupted her. They wouldn't let her get a word out. They asked the same questions over and over and over. They asked about the same case over and over and over. They asked questions, they would kind of preface their questions with, this involved prepubescent children, and you think it's okay, you know what I mean? It was just, none of it was genuine. And that
Let me ask you a question for people who didn't watch all the
Mhm.
hearings. Did did she was she the judge in a particularly large amount of child pornography cases? Like, is there other than the QAnon backdrop and the fact that you know child pornography, the production of it, the selling is upsetting for everybody. But why? But again, besides the QAnon backdrop, was she particularly lenient? Was she a judge who only dealt with child pornography cases? Give us the context.
I mean, that's the hard thing. There's not really a lot of context. Basically, she gave out some sentences that were less than what the prosecutors were seeking, which, to anyone who knows anything about law, is not like a rare occurrence. You've
Right.
got prosecutors usually seeking higher sentences. You've got the defense seeking lower sentences. You've got the government sometimes in between. You've got the probation office. And so I think I really think they just kind of found something that they knew would stick because it's awful and it makes your stomach hurt to hear about. Um, and so you kind of had this behavior where their performances, again, even more than anything else, were just incredibly repetitive. It got to the point where she said, I've explained this many times. I'm not going to do it anymore. And then Holly tried to turn that into a mini scandal of like, what, you're not answering my question? You're not answering my question. But the problem is when you've got behavior like that, that's odious and meant to humiliate her and meant to imply that she is almost no better than a pedophile. That's the time when I really, really strongly feel that you need to have Democrats who have the chutzpah to be like, we're not entertaining this, to take a tone of how dare you. Can you imagine even for a moment what the reaction would be if Amy Coney Barrett was called 1 degree better than a pedophile after Republicans spent the entirety of her hearing focusing much more on her motherhood than her legal background? It just
Hmm.
wouldn't have happened. And
Yeah.
here you've got Jackson sitting in front of her child, and you've got Holly saying she endangers children. She as a judge endangers children. And I'm sorry, but that's beyond the pale. And you've got to break out of your we're just senators joshing around with each other mold at that point. And Durbin really, I don't think he could. I mean, he at times he would kind of try to stop people from interrupting, but for all the talk of kind of how Feinstein is old and over the hill and can't handle it anymore, I'm not sure that he really did much better of a job. I think the most effective rebuttal in the whole hearings came from Mazie Hirono, who's so junior, on the committee that you had to wait a million hours before it got to her. But then she kind of brought up all these other judges who had given out sentences in child porn cases that were, below the sentencing guidelines, and that Republicans had voted to confirm. So, her whole line of questioning was, Judge so and so gave out this sentence. Are my Republican colleagues soft on possessors of child porn? And it was really, really effective because it showed that the argument is silly and that it doesn't make any sense. But for the most part, it was this completely bizarre rhythm where you would have these Republicans hurling these horrible accusations and seeming to delight in sharing the details of these just heinous crimes. And then the baton would pass to a Democrat who would say, so you are on the debate team. And it's just like, what are we doing here? What are we
Right.
doing? It went
Right.
from a crescendo of tension into a soporific lull. And you just found yourself kind of looking at the member list and waiting to see who the next kind of gross Fox News seeking Republican was going to be, who was going to pull out his next chart with all these kind of accusations on them.
It's funny with Dick Durbin. He is kind of has these kind of get along, go along tendencies. Um, and the funny thing was, I looked this up, and it was actually a little more than I thought. Dick Durbin is not a young guy. He's 77 years old. I was actually a little surprised.
Wow. That's older than I'd
I
guess.
figured he was like in his early 70s, maybe
Yep.
71. He's 77. I mean, he's spry. I've I know people in their late 70s. They've a lot of them have slowed down a lot. But there is this kind of uh broader issue that a lot of people up on Capitol Hill are not young people. They've been doing it for a long time, and it's funny. You have God, what's the I'm totally spacing on the junior senator from Delaware, the guy who what's his,
Coons?
yeah, Coons. You know, he is kind of in that mold of we need more, we need to reach across the aisle,
Mm-hmm.
and always that kind of stuff. And I get that. To me it's sort of like, yeah, if there was, that'd be nice, but that's not how we're doing things now. And I really
Yeah.
don't think it's the Democrats doing. Yeah, I struggle with how to come down on that because the sociology and the characterology of the two parties, it's different.
Totally.
I mean, you Democrats play to cameras. You know, Democrats have their issues, but you would not see something comparable to this. You would
Mm-hmm.
not see Democrats with this kind of level of character assassination with nonsensical attacks. It just doesn't work that way. And it's not even because it's not. I mean, I'm sure some Democrats might, if it worked for them. It wouldn't work for them. And you can say, well, there's no Fox News. Well, yeah, there's no Fox News, but it's because a Fox News of the left wouldn't work the same way. Because if you had someone doing something like that, now Republicans would say, hey, Kavanaugh, it was terrible, they attacked, blah 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 blah. But there was a woman who had a fairly, who sounded very credible and had a very upsetting story. They didn't make that up, and they didn't expect it, right? It was really out of the blue. I mean, they definitely didn't want Kavanaugh to be confirmed, but they didn't. People, that was not expected. It wasn't like when he was nominated, everybody's like, "Oh, his rep, his Me Too rep." It wasn't. That wasn't a thing. So it's not just Fox exists because the Republican Party, the sociology of the Republican Party, the leadership of the Republican Party, the voters of the Republican Party act and react to certain things in different ways. And um, I kind of get what where the Democrats are coming from at some level to kind of, we don't want to dignify this, or we don't want to kind of make it the other hand, like, no, she's not a pedophile. You want to kind of, it's tough. I have no sense of like how it is played more generally. And we haven't even, I mean, what we have only barely touched on is kind of sitting out there, and everyone knows it, that this is basically a way to play to the Pizzagate, QAnon, Hillary, has an international ring, a pedophile ring, all that kind of craziness. And this is their way to kind of ingratiate themselves with that world, and also to have some deniability. And that's just, that's the politics that we live in.
Yeah, I think, and I do want to get more into the embrace of the QAnon stuff, but on the point of what Democrats do, I think I very much agree with you. And I think it's so easy to watch and be kind of infuriated by Democrats not looking able to meet the moment, by Democrats looking like they still live in this era of like John McCain comedy, when we've got Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz are the party now. But I very much agree with you that I think it's easy to come to that conclusion. It's much harder to take the next logical step, which is, so what should they do? How do you combat it? How do you debate someone to whom facts don't matter, and to whom the optics of what you're saying is much, much more important than the context? For people who, I wrote this up and this is on our site now, but Hawley, Cruz, Cotton, Graham all got spots on Fox News last night, and they did so without fear of a fact check, because they knew that the hosts would cheer on these accusations and bolster them. And now we're in a situation where the big fear, and what some like Don Jr. and Judicial Watch are trying to do, is now take this misinformation campaign and use it to sway Manchin and Sinema out of voting for her. And it doesn't appear at this moment like that is working. And earlier in the week, when Manchin was asked about this, he was basically like, well, who's saying it? Oh, Hawley. Well, yeah, well, there it is. He seemed kind of rightly dismissive of the source, but it that is that has been effective before.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it hard to know what to do with, because that's the biggest kind of fault of Democrats that I see in this, which is there is still this tendency to entertain it, even when it's kind of ridiculous and a character assassination. You had the Republicans all all except Ben Sass, sign this letter saying they want access to the pre-sentencing reports in these child pornography cases, which, to be clear, Jackson did not write. They were, it's not like that was her opinion. That's now sealed. And the reason that they're sealed is obviously because of the information they contain. The
And those are like those are done by like a government office that kind of collects how are
that's
those produced again?
that's my understanding. And they are replete with details about the crime committed. So to me, that's something, that's a Ted Cruz project, right? Saying like they're withholding information that we need to see how she sentenced these cases, when the whole premise is not true. And the further degree of that you need to see details of horrible crimes committed against children, with or without the victim's permission, by the way, is just ridiculous. Like, to me, you get that letter and you're like, yeah, okay, we'll work on it, and you just stonewall for a while until Republicans kind of find their next shiny thing. But instead, Democrats on the committee are like talking about it. And I agree with Durbin, who's saying he won't have it on his conscience to have potentially details of these crimes, leaked out, and everything like that. But
Well, I would
it,
think that's the point. I mean, that's obviously the point. The
right,
point is to get them, and I'm sure they are filled with really awful, you know, awful crimes and terrible things that happen to people, and the point is just to kind of, crack those open and find terrible things and just sort of, splash them on her. And
Right.
that's the whole point. And it's pretty straightforward. And yeah.
But that's my concern. Like there's we there still just isn't a good way for Democrats to push back against this disinformation or to find some way of invalidating it without giving it a platform that de facto raises its credibility just because
Hmm.
it's being talked about in these forums. Now it's a topic of discussion among the Senate Judiciary Committee that's on C-SPAN, and that just lends it a layer of gravitas that he doesn't deserve. And that's still a puzzle to me. I just don't, and obviously Democrats haven't figured out how to do it either, but it's not clear to me how you fight back against something like this when it's rooted in comfort with lying and a platform that will amplify those lies.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I actually think it's pretty straightforward. You just say, look, we know this is normal judge process. You know, different sentences are handed out. You were using this because in your world, you have all these crazy conspiracy theories, and that's the kind of the mess of your party, just whole kind of universes of lies, and you want to kind of you want that wind in your sails, and we know what you're doing, and we're just not even going to participate. We're not going to get into whether or not you see this. We know what you're doing. We know exactly what you're doing, and you know what we're doing, and we're not going to play along. Period. And I do think that is just the answer. You guys, your party is a mess. You have bad people, liars in your party that create these whole ecosystems of lies. Everybody knows it, everybody talks about it. And not only are you not brave enough to do anything about it, you want to benefit from it. And that's what you're doing here. And we all know it. And you just want to pick through this to kind of, have your cake and eat it too. But we're not even going to play along because you're not being straight. You're playing games, and that's it. And I do think that's the answer. And
Yeah.
and and I wish whoever would say it. I think any Democrat who says, "Well, I don't agree, but for the process, we need to consider, does the Senate need?" No, it doesn't, because you're just lying, and this is about your cowardice, about you're trying to lie to people, about how you're trying to profit from liars. So no.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally right. Let's talk about the piece of this that is Pizzagate has, for all intents and purposes, like as we've seen from this hearing, become a tenet of the Republican Party. I mean, this is really the first time that we've seen such a full-fledged example of the kind of recesses of QAnon bleeding fully into the Republican mainstream. And it's not even just the four that we've been talking about who are kind of the usual suspects of trying to get on Fox News at all costs. Like, John Cornyn kind of mentioned it. It came out, well, Blackburn's kind of crazy, but others kind of, if they weren't willing to go into the gross child porn world, would allude to a soft on crime thing. I mean, it's clearly become a mainstream thing. And that's kind of shocking because this started out as a very fringy thing. And it was always defined by an obsession with sexual crimes done to children. That was there from the beginning. And it kind of grew into the crimes are being perpetrated by our political enemies, by Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, Barack Obama, what have you. And it all ties into this kind of older idea about the shadowy cabal of elites that are pulling the strings, that are nothing is what it seems, but that still always comes back to this weird obsession with child sex trafficking. And now really just the fact that Jackson has kind of sentenced child porn cases was enough of a connection to pull her into that world as someone who is a sympathizer to these kind of child porn possessors. So, I mean, what do you make of that? That it's bled in quickly in the absence of Trump even.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it just doesn't. I can't even. It doesn't surprise me because I know that is the world that we currently live in, and the Republican Party is made up of and controlled by about 30% of the electorate that is, you know, revanchist, Christian nationalist, whatever you want to call it, the Trump thing, and this is their world. And if you want to operate in the Republican Party, you need to cater to that, and that is the world that we're in. And you know, uh, it's raining today where I am. I don't really think anything of it because I know it rains, right? And that's honestly kind of where I am because it is sort of stunning, and yet we kind of know this is true. This isn't the first time that uh, you've had Republicans trying to be Q adjacent, for lack of a better word. They can't actually say, "I want to have hearings into into the what is it, ping pong pizza? What's the place called?
Oh,
I can't,
Comet Ping Pong.
Comet ping pong. Uh, I want to find out what's going on in the basement there, or something like that. But they know what they need to appeal to, and that's how these folks work. And it's funny because it used to be, 25 years ago, it used to be, well, they're for the gays, gay teachers. And you know what gay teachers do with little boys? That kind of stuff. So in a sense, you had a kind of a a not totally dissimilar moral panic framework that was focused in a different way because it was fine to sort of vilify gay people, mainly gay men, but gay men, lesbians, blah 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 blah. I mean, believe me, that was, you had one of the big thing. God, when was that exactly? It was actually part of. I mean, I remember this because I was a little boy. It was part of one of the activism cycles that actually brought Harvey Milk to prominence. But there was a referendum, a proposition in California that I think it was in the mid late 70s, and it was basically that you couldn't have gay teachers in the public schools, and I don't know exactly how I mean, it's so unbelievable, now kind of like what, but this was a thing. And it was funny because it was actually, I'm trying to remember now. I think Ronald Reagan was already not governor anymore, but I think even he opposed it. And Reagan himself was always never kind of that, came out of Hollywood. He, kind of he lived in that world. So he was happy to get on board with that stuff, but not that close kind of stuff. In any case, that used to be normal. That part of the right was basically saying you can't give gay people rights or let them teach in schools or let them rent an apartment because they're going to get to the kids and they're going to molest the kids. This was just normal. I mean, normal in the sense that was just happened all the time. That was a normal part of politics, and that was so. In a way, I'm trying to get my head around whether this like is this. Does that mean it's very different, or it's not different? It is part of some sort of comparable moral panic politics. Um, so maybe things don't change that much. I don't know.
I mean, I guess it's like if you look at all the stuff with trans kids now coming out of southern states. And even abortion has always been fought on the battleground of children and babies. It's, the whole anti-abortion movement is predicated on referring to, unborn children. That language is, very on purpose. So I mean, it is a good point that a lot of these kind of culture wars are fought on the battleground of children, and that it's not a new practice for Republicans to say that their political enemies or their enemies of any kind are not just bad. They're doing the worst thing you can imagine, which is hurting children.
Hmm. I mean, it's funny. I have to mention. I saw this. I saw this press release. The governor. I'm pretty certain that I have this right. The governor of Utah, who obviously is a Republican, how could he not be?
Yeah.
Just vetoed one of these bills,
Mhm.
one of these trans sports bills, and he put out a statement, and it was very. Uh, it it was a powerful statement because how I would describe it, he was basically saying, "Look, I'm a conservative guy. I've got a hard time getting my head around the trans thing, right? And Mormonism and very conservative, whatever." But he said, but I've listened and he basically pointed out I guess there is one child in the whole state who is a trans girl who is playing on a female team. One child. And there's like three, I guess, trans boys who are playing. And he makes the point like none of them are champions. They're just he goes into the stuff about suicidality and it was just very powerful because he's like, you know what? I can't say I understand all this stuff completely, but are we really doing this about like two kids in the whole state who are probably feeling more whole and are more secure in their lives and not going to hurt themselves because they're playing a sport? And like, yes, there's those memes you see. I guess there's one trans woman swimmer who's like the big poster person for this issue. um it was, I don't know, it was just it's worth looking up. It was sort of like you're like, okay, sometimes people step outside the moment. And he had this thing where he just said, you know what, I try to bring it back to just compassion, don't hurt people, and I just don't think we can support this. And it was very powerful.
Yeah, and I don't think Spencer Cox is the only one to do that. If I'm remembering correctly, I think Asa Hutchinson of
Yeah,
the
there's a
governor of
few.
Arkansas
Yeah.
did a similar thing and kind of cited similar reasoning, like the theme of kind of like their kids. Are we really going to go after kids like this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, the statement is very powerful. And we're kind of running out of time. And the other thing that I did want to talk about from the hearings before we wrap up is that we also got a sense, kind of the imminent fall of Roe was very much in the background of these hearings. Um, a lot of Republicans spent their time talking about, let's talk about wrongly decided precedent and when it's okay to overturn precedent, But more interestingly, a lot of them also, I think, gave indicators of where the right wing movement is going to go after they win on Roe, kind of what precedents are going to be in the crosshairs next. Obergefell came up a lot, same sex marriage. You had Marsha Blackburn brought up, the right to privacy that let married couples use birth control in Griswold versus Connecticut. This didn't happen out in the hearings, but got a lot of headlines outside of them when you had Mike Braun say that Loving was wrongly decided and that it should go back to the states to decide about interracial marriage, which I think hit particularly hard considering that Ketanji Brown Jackson is married to a white man and was, on the stand at the time. So we are getting indications, and this has come up in all my conversations with kind of legal experts around abortion, and the next kind of front of that is that as soon as you get this really big, big, big win for these people. I mean, decades in the making, the overturning of Roe, that other precedent won't be safe because so much of it is of a piece, is of the
Mhm.
same idea. This came up a lot in the hearings too. Like, why do we have unenumerated rights? We shouldn't have unenumerated rights. So much is an unenumerated right. The Constitution just doesn't cover that much. So it was interesting, I think, that we're getting kind of the tip of
Well,
the
it does seem like
spear.
when they are in power,
Mhm.
Republicans are fine with Second Amendment and nothing else
Exactly.
when they're in
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
It there's, one thing I have a hard time getting my head around, and it's worth noting that Loving is, comes from a much different, kind of jurisprudential branch than Griswold, Roe, it's let's put it this way. I would say that Loving is just a direct, clear, and unavoidable product of the 14th Amendment. It is really clear cut in a way that Griswold and Roe are not as clear cut. That doesn't mean I don't support them. I'm just saying that there's a more complex, a more complex and indirect reasoning behind them. But what I'm struck by when this comes up with Griswold is that, like, you know, there is a substantial minority in this country that does not think women should be allowed to get abortions. There is a bigger group that is not comfortable with the idea. We know this. Are there really people out there who you go to the CVS and you see the big rack of condoms, right? And, like, obviously that's I bring that up because that's visible, right, in a way that birth control pills are not. They probably should be. And this whole other issue, whether you should need to, kind of go to the doctor, blah 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 blah. But, like, I always, it's a little weird to me because I know the Catholic Church is teaching on birth control, but as a political matter, as just the world we live in, I really I find it hard to believe that anybody thinks that has much political traction. I don't know if I'm crazy, but, like, if you're really like, you wore a condom. What were you thinking? I mean, I don't even. I saw where that was
Mhm.
going. I don't want to get into what you were thinking, but is anybody living in that world where, like, birth control? It's a bridge too far.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Griswold thing came from Marsha Blackburn, who is one of the nuttiers, but but she takes her cues very much from the right-wing media ecosystem. I mean, like, her questions in this hearing were a word cloud of what you would see on primetime Fox News, to the point that a lot of it was hard to follow.
I mean,
But
I guess I'm saying I can almost follow the Pizzagate stuff more because I get, like, you're crazy. You want to believe your political opponents are evil, like evil,
Mhm.
not bad, evil. And so you kind of think, like, are they child pornographers? Like, oh, because child pornography obviously is pretty bad. That politics makes more sense to me than kind of like the country is overrun with birth control. When is it going to be enough?
Yeah.
I just
I mean, I agree with you, yet at the same time, I graduated from Georgetown in 2017, and while I was there, the on-campus, medical unit would not fill birth control prescriptions. So,
yeah, I guess I at least with the Catholic Church, they have obviously Georgetown's a Catholic university. It's run by the Jesuits, right?
yep.
Okay. Uh that's a doctrine. So kind of like, okay, like, you're working within that framework and you're Catholic university, okay, kind of get it. Get it. That's your rules, you know. Uh Jews wear tzitzis. There's all sorts of ritual. I mean, it's not ritual and whatever. Religions are strange. But for the law to kind of say, like, I mean, again, it's this kind of thing I think about. Like, it is just it was certainly different 50 years ago, but like there's an aisle in CVS.
Yeah.
It couldn't be more normal.
I mean, I think though that is an interesting question in general, which is we've seen that even though Mitch McConnell basically keeps trying to push this idea of like, keep this stuff to yourself, just stop talking about it. We'll win the midterms if you don't do anything that creates this big backlash. That Republicans are intrinsically unable to not talk about this stuff, even when it's unpopular. And that I think is a really interesting question, which is Roe's about to fall. Other precedents are like within reach, if we are headed for a world where Republicans are dead set on overturning Obergefell, on, I don't know, overturning Loving, I can't imagine, but overturning Griswold, I mean, those things would be super enervating to their base, to maybe that 30% we were talking about. But does that risk dislodging them from their comfortable position right now? The idea that they're going for these things that people now are very comfortable regarding as fundamental rights, is a backlash to that great enough to kind of threaten their momentum? Will that idea of the unpopularity of going for those things affect their actions at all?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I have a hard time. Well, this is one of the things about how we structure the judicial system, that those 6 justices, they're a law unto themselves
Yeah.
for as long as they're alive. Um, and certainly some of them would probably be into this stuff, and to some extent some of them probably don't care about the electoral consequences for the Republican Party. um yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to end on, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the Republican behavior in these hearings, which I think is really important and does give us really, really important kind of guideposts as to where the party is and where it's going. And it's important to know that and to talk about it, because otherwise it just kind of happens in the dark. But I do want to say that I thought Judge Jackson performed really well. I thought the most impressive that she was to me is in the few times she got the chance to actually kind of explain her legal decisions. I thought she was really, really good at translating complicated stuff into layman's language. And a compelling thing to me is that, it's already a joke that she writes really long opinions, and she talked about that. But she said, and she does it very purposefully, because she wants people to understand why she decided the way that she did, especially considering that people who come before her in the courtroom, especially as a defense criminal defender, are, they're not lawyers and they don't have degrees and they don't necessarily understand this stuff. So she wants people to understand why she's making a decision and how she came to it and what that means. And I think that's really important, and especially because if she gets confirmed, she's going to be spending a whole lot of her time writing dissents and joining in dissents. And I think having clear, driving, powerful dissents, even just for kind of posterity at this moment, is really
Hmm.
important. So I don't know, that's a positive that I saw in these hearings that were dominated by really cynical, craven behavior.
Right, right. Well, we live in a disordered time in many ways.
Yes.
Let me remind people that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off your order if you go to Grady'sColdBrew.com and use the promo code TPM. So give it a try. It's really great stuff. I mean, I'm too addicted to it. But anyway, it's the best iced coffee around, and they support our efforts. And I guess that's well. And also remember, we are in our membership drive. If you are not a member of TPM, if you're not a subscriber, please give it a try. We'd really appreciate it. And that's how we run this operation. And I think that's it for this week.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.